Hello and welcome to this lecture on early intervention. So I think it's a good idea that we start thinking about some of the things that we do for disorders before we actually start thinking about some of those mental health conditions. And I think it's a good idea to actually look at what we can do to prevent and/or intervene early, because of course what we want to do is think about trying to minimize the severity of the outcomes for children. So by the end of this, hopefully you'll be able to define what an early intervention is and identify some early intervention practices. So when we're looking at mental health in Australia, we're also obviously concerned about the prevalence. And you can see here that I've just summarised some of the information that we had from the National Mental Health Strategy for Children and also the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare. So you can see there that they suggest that about 50% of all adult mental health issues occur before the age of 14. So we really are trying to think about prevention here. And the other aspects that we're thinking about is that 7 out of 10 of the most common presentations to children's services, paediatricians and so on, are for mental health conditions. And according to the AIHW, as already cited in your course materials, anxiety, major depressive disorders, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and conduct disorders are the 4 most common. And so it's really important to think about this because the students that are all under scrutiny in schools. So this is why we tend to find this emergence before the age of 14, because it's not just a family looking at an individual, it's also schools and health professionals. And so then there's this collaborative idea of actually there's something that's happening for this young person that we need to intervene with. And if we're starting to look at this age group that we've got, of course, we're going to see some of these things showing themselves in a school environment. For example, ADHD and conduct disorders will become more obvious because there'll be some elements of those school boundaries that will need to be adjusted or indeed enforced depending on that child's behaviour. And we will look at this in more detail in Module 4. So if we take a greater look at some of these statistics, you'll see that there is differences between males and females, and we do particularly see that with ADHD. There's a greater percentage of males than females being diagnosed with that, and again there's a whole heap of theories as to why that might be. One in which around the way it presents, but also around the way in which behaviour is considered. And also with anxiety disorders, it's actually quite evenly spaced, which might surprise some of you because I think historically it's been thought of as a female disorder. But there may well be some statistics that suggest it is slightly more prevalent in females. So what can we do with these sorts of statistics? Well, what it means to us is it knows how we are going to plan for the future, and it helps us to think about early intervention. So when we think of mental health interventions, we tend to think about this action type plan that's depicted here in this picture. And what we start to think about is some of those things that are preventative and some of those things that are early interventions. So when we're thinking about the prevention, as you can see here indicated, we have universal, selective and indicated elements, and you can also see that early intervention and prevention actually cross over as well. So I suppose that for any mental health intervention, we think about that spectrum of prevention and early involvement, early engagement, and we're not thinking about continuing care, and we're not really usually thinking about treatment, although some early interventions might fall into treatment areas. So with prevention, we start off thinking about the universal aspects, and universal is what we look to present in any one environment. So for example, all school-age children are in year I don't know, say 2 for example, are given information about how to try and promote their physical well-being and their emotional well-being by engaging in sport. That would be universal. It's delivered to all of the children. Okay. So we know from there we then go to selective, and we might be looking at some particular groups of children. For example, we might think about looking at those targeted who live in a low socioeconomic area, for example, where there's high rates of unemployment. And we can see that within that community there's actually a significant risk factor for low self-esteem. So we might target that communities and schools in those areas with specific education, maybe training for the staff, or it might be directed at the children. And we hope that that would break down the cycle. And then we would go into indicated. And indicated could still be a preventative measure, or it might be an early intervention. So perhaps in the indicated group, we've identified a group of students within a school, or just specific individuals within a school, that have low self-esteem, for example. The teachers have noticed that these children don't seem to feel good about themselves. Or it might be children that seem to be experiencing perhaps some symptoms that could be attributable to anxiety, for example. And we might actually put them into a program that's designed to help them achieve. And one such thing is a resilience program. So children who are indicated as having at-risk factors and at-risk presentations might well go into this group. And from there on we move into treatment. And treatment would come from the assessment, of course, of an individual, trying to work out what's the diagnosis and what's wrong with them. But it could still be that it's an early intervention at that stage. For example, we might be seeing a child that's quite anxious, but when we do the assessment, they don't actually yet have an anxiety disorder. So we might start some early interventions here. And that might be working with maybe fears. It might be working with some active health promotion interventions. And it might start with potentially some CBT type interventions. And we'll look at those in more detail in Module 3. So really when we're thinking about early intervention, we're thinking in this green arrow area, the prevention, universal, selective, indicated, and or we might be thinking about those students or individuals, not always in school of course, who have maybe some symptom identification, and we're thinking about early intervention. So with the prevention overall, we're looking at what we're going to do to think about how we are going to intervene. And when we're thinking about promotion, we're thinking about any action that's taken to promote positive mental health and maximise the well-being amongst populations. So when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about what we might do to enable people to have really, really good health. And there's lots and lots of different things out there. So access to parks, access to public places, health promotion includes mental well-being adverts. It can include activities that go on in schools and after schools. It could be outdoor education, schools education activities. So there's a whole range of things that we might be looking at when we're doing health promotion. So outdoor education, for example, could be high ropes, or it could be a befriending program. There's a whole range of things, and of course it's going to be age appropriate. When we're looking at prevention, we're actually looking at the factors that lead to mental health problems. So this might be your more targeted group of a child, of someone, for example, who has a mental health condition themselves. So we may be acknowledging that parents with a mental health condition may be more likely to have children that also experience mental health conditions. So we might be thinking about programs where we increase the protective factors. So how can we actually work with the parent to enable them to be more self-aware, to enable them to protect their child, for example. And how might we decrease some of those risk factors? So what can we do to get parents into treatment, maybe? So there's a whole range of things about how we actually help children in this area. It might be helping the children learn to cope, building resilience. And then early intervention then is the acknowledgement, that's maybe the identification of early emotional difficulties or early mental health difficulties. And it's about having a swift response to reduce the progression and impact of issues. So this is where we actually are trying to address things like low self-esteem. We might be addressing fears and phobias. We may be thinking about how we can stop teens drinking or the impact of social media, for example. So there's a range of different things that might come in here. Bullying might be another thing. So if we just take a little look at the broad age groups, so with infants 0 to 2, we'll probably be thinking about looking at the identification of at-risk families. And examples of how we did this is identification of early pregnancy care. So for example, teenage mums and dads, they usually get a bespoke pregnancy service that helps them to embrace their journey into adulthood and into parenthood. Also supports at-risk pregnancies. So for example, if you're a parent that's previously had some difficulties with your pregnancy care, you may well be very well supported during your pregnancy so that the emotional trauma of those previous experiences don't carry through to this one. There is, of course, child safety services within this, and children who are born to families that already have pre-existing child safety will be additionally supported. And there is, of course, universal screening for both infants and pregnant mums and dads, and also the parents in that postpartum period, things like the Edinburgh Depression Scale, for example. Within this period as well, there's access to in-home services that might well be health visiting, child health services, for example, and that will include developmental support. But there'll also be support for parents, for example, who have a mental illness themselves from mental health teams to assist them. So when the baby's feeling safe and secure, as we've talked about, we recognise that mums and dads are able to best support their families, and we want to ensure that babies and infants get the best start to life. Then in early childhood, we might be thinking about the babyhood visiting program, as I said, family support, parenting programs as well. We might be thinking about how we engage parents with some of the early start programs that occur. Some of those are through daycare services, but some of them are also voluntarily. So the Triple P parenting program, for example, which we'll come to think about more in your modules. During this period of time, of course, there's lots of developmental milestones that children should be getting ready for, as you know. So again, daycares have some support in there, family supports and parenting programs likewise. And we will also be thinking about universal workplace policies. So parental leave is a good example of that, flexible working and how that supports families and helps families engage to support their children. And of course, there's universal screening that continues throughout a child's development period. And then in school years, we're thinking about school-based initiatives. So we might be thinking about self-esteem, life skills, the simple things of teaching children how to become more independent, tying their shoelaces, being responsible for their own work. All of these kinds of things are really important to a person's self-esteem and sense of self-efficacy and self-determination. Some schools might introduce things like making lunches, or indeed lunchbox programs for those children who are identified at risk from a socio-economic program. And resilience building is a big part of that. There's also teacher training to ensure that teaching staff, and that goes throughout the school, not just the teachers, are able to identify those children who are at risk and who are showing less resilience. And then there's safe environment programs, so anti-bullying is a really good example of that. And then moving to the adolescent years, we're thinking about role modelling, peer mentoring, student support. This is where your teen mental health supports come in. And again, we'll think about that later on in some of the modules. We think about how students are particularly good at mentoring their peers. At this stage as well, we're thinking about having adolescents and, of course, child-specific health services, but adolescent-specific services are so important for that inclusivity. And that also goes with regards to thinking about, school chaplains, school guidance counsellors, nurses, etc. There should be whole school approaches, and again, this might be social media, it might be bullying, it might be uniform even, keeping everybody looking the same, so there's a reduced perspective of difference. So how do schools do this whole school approach? Do they have a self-development program every morning when they do roll call, for example? Outdoor weekends, activities after school, and then there's parenting education, and again Triple P parenting program comes into this, but there's a whole range of others too. So that brings us to the end. These references here have informed my discussion here. There's lots more information, of course, in your student notes, and hopefully that gives you a brief understanding as to early intervention, and I do encourage you to read around the subject. Thanks for listening.